At the corner of Fifth Avenue stood the neighborhood Walmart, where folks could find just about anything they needed. On this particular day, Officer Henry Winters, a police officer with the Maplewood Police Department, had just finished his patrol around the Walmart parking lot. After a long morning shift, Henry decided to step inside the Walmart to grab a bottle of water. As he strolled down the aisles, his gaze fell upon a woman standing near the shelves on the far side of the store. She was a black woman, dressed casually in a long dress, glancing over the items on the shelves as though she was searching for something in particular. Henry narrowed his eyes, watching her with a certain intensity. The woman, her name was Nancy Westlake, had come to Walmart that day just to pick up a few things for her family. Nancy was quiet, friendly, and a proud member of the town. She worked hard and often kept to herself. But on this day, she hadn't thought to grab a shopping cart, figuring she'd only get a couple of things and didn't need one. As Nancy moved from one aisle to the next, Henry couldn't shake the suspicion building in his mind. He noticed she held a small item in her hand, a jar of peanut butter, and she wasn't placing it in a cart or basket. Henry, already feeling a surge of distrust, couldn't help but assume the worst. "Is she trying to steal?" he thought to himself. Without thinking twice, he stepped closer, keeping his eyes fixed on her, feeling certain that he had caught her in the act. When Nancy paused near another shelf, picking up a loaf of bread, Henry decided it was time to confront her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice booming as he approached her. Nancy turned to see him standing there, his expression cold and accusing. "Mind telling me what you're up to?" Nancy blinked, a bit surprised by his question. She glanced at the items in her hand, then back at Henry, unsure of what he meant. "I'm just shopping," she replied calmly, her gaze meeting his with a steady, polite look. Henry crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "Funny thing is, I don't see a cart or basket. Just wandering around holding things, huh? Not planning to pay?" Nancy took a steady breath, keeping her cool. She was well aware of the undertones of his questions, but chose to keep her response respectful. "I didn't get a cart because I'm only buying a couple of items. I'm heading to the checkout after this," she explained. But Henry wasn't convinced. Years on the force had left him with a hardened view of people, and he'd made up his mind about her. "Sure, that's what they all say." "I know you're kind," he sneered. "Thinking you can just take things without paying because no one's watching." At this, Nancy felt a hint of frustration, but she held her ground. "Officer, I assure you, I have every intention of paying," she said, her voice firm but still calm. "And if you'd like, I'll head to the checkout now so you can see for yourself." But Henry wasn't ready to let her off that easily. "I don't need your excuses. Hand over what you're holding," he demanded, reaching out to grab the items from her hands. Nancy took a step back, holding her hands up defensively. "There's no need for this," she said. "I'm just trying to buy some things for my family." Henry's face tightened, his eyes flashing with something cold. "Maybe you didn't understand." "I said hand it over," he repeated, louder this time, drawing the attention of other shoppers nearby. Nancy glanced around, feeling the weight of the stares. People were watching, whispering, and it was clear that Henry was not backing down. She knew there was no reason to argue, but she couldn't ignore the injustice she was facing. She held out the items, placing them carefully in Henry's hands, never breaking eye contact with him. Just then, a Walmart employee approached, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, looking between Nancy and Henry. Henry shot him a quick look. "We're fine. I'm just dealing with a potential shoplifter here," he said, his tone dismissive. The employee glanced at Nancy, recognizing her as a regular customer. "Are you sure? She's here often." "I've never seen any issues with her before," he said, trying to defuse the situation. Henry cut him off sharply. "I know what I'm doing. You can go back to your work," he said, turning his attention back to Nancy, who was now standing silently, her face a mask of calm. As Henry prepared to take her to the front of the store, a thought crossed Nancy's mind. "Officer, I think you're making a mistake," she said gently. But Henry only scoffed. "The only mistake here is thinking you could get away with it." Little did he know, his actions would soon come back to haunt him in a way he'd never expected. With the situation escalating, Nancy knew she had to keep calm. She had dealt with people like Henry before, quick to judge, quick to assume, and never bothering to understand the full picture. But she wasn't just any shopper, and she certainly wasn't helpless. She was patient, watching Henry carefully as he puffed up with authority, clearly enjoying his role as the enforcer. "Follow me to the front of the store," Henry barked, his grip tightening around the jar of peanut butter and loaf of bread he'd taken from her. Nancy didn't resist. Instead, she walked beside him, her expression calm and thoughtful, not a trace of fear in her eyes. Shoppers stepped aside, watching the scene unfold with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Some murmured, wondering what she could have done, while others exchanged knowing looks, suspecting that the officer had overstepped. They reached the front of the store, near the checkout counters, where a small crowd had started to gather. Henry motioned to a store security guard to come over. "We've got a thief here," he announced, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Caught her red-handed trying to sneak out with these items." The security guard, a young man named Carlos who had been working at the Walmart for years, looked at Nancy and then back at Henry, slightly confused. "Officer, I know this woman. She's here all the time." "I've never seen her cause any trouble," Carlos said, trying to reason with Henry. But Henry was having none of it. "Doesn't matter what you think you know," he shot back. "Today, I caught her with these items, and she had no cart, no intention to pay. That's stealing, plain and simple." Carlos frowned, sensing something wasn't right, but he didn't want to challenge Henry's authority in front of the customers. "Well, maybe we should check the security cameras, just to be sure," he suggested hesitantly. Henry rolled his eyes, dismissing the idea. "No need. I saw it with my own eyes." At this point, Nancy spoke up, her voice steady and calm. "Actually, I think it's a great idea to check the cameras. I'd like everyone to see exactly what happened," she said, meeting Henry's gaze with a cool confidence that seemed to unnerve him. Henry sneered, but Nancy's composure was beginning to crack his certainty. "Fine," he snapped. "If you're so eager to prove your innocence, we'll check the cameras." He turned to Carlos. "Lead the way." Carlos nodded, and together, they all made their way to the small room in the back of the store where the security footage was monitored. The crowd dispersed a bit, but a few onlookers stayed nearby, curious to see how the situation would unfold. As they walked, Nancy remained silent, while Henry's confidence seemed to waver, if only slightly. Once inside the security room, Carlos pulled up the footage from the aisle where Nancy had been shopping. As the video played, it showed Nancy moving from one shelf to another, picking up items with no indication of hiding or attempting to leave without paying. She browsed calmly, inspecting items just like any other shopper. "There," Nancy said, pointing at the screen. "You can see I was simply shopping, not sneaking or attempting to steal." Carlos glanced at Henry, waiting for his reaction, but Henry's face had turned red. He looked away from the screen, refusing to acknowledge the truth of what he was seeing. "That doesn't prove anything," he muttered. "Maybe you're just good at hiding things. We should do a search." Nancy took a deep breath, her patience thinning, but she kept her voice steady. "Officer Winters, I don't think you understand the position you're in." She reached into her pocket slowly, careful not to startle him, and pulled out a small badge. "I'm Sheriff Nancy Westlake with the Maplewood Sheriff's Department," she said, holding the badge up for him to see. Henry's eyes widened, and for a moment, he was speechless. He stared at the badge, realization dawning on him that he'd just tried to bully and arrest a fellow officer, someone who outranked him. Carlos looked back and forth between Nancy and Henry, stunned by the turn of events. "Oh, wow. Sheriff Westlake, I'm so sorry," Carlos stammered, clearly taken aback. "I had no idea." Nancy smiled gently at Carlos. "It's all right, Carlos. You were just doing your job," she said, then turned her attention back to Henry. "But Officer Winters here seems to have a habit of making assumptions. Dangerous assumptions at that." Henry's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but struggled to find the right words. I didn't know. I didn't realize." Nancy cut him off, her tone now sharp and unyielding. "That's the problem, Officer Winters. You didn't take the time to know, to understand. Instead, you judged me based on nothing but your own biases," she said, her gaze steady and unflinching. "And you've made a serious mistake." Henry stood there, stammering, his hands clenching and unclenching as he tried to regain his composure. But it was too late. The damage was done, and he knew it. Just then, a store manager entered the room, having heard about the incident. He quickly assessed the situation and, seeing Nancy's badge, realized this was more serious than he'd first thought. "Sheriff Westlake, is there anything we can do to help resolve this?" he asked, eyeing Henry with a look of disapproval. Nancy looked at Henry, her face calm but firm. "I think Officer Winters needs to learn that actions have consequences," she said quietly. "There's no room for this kind of behavior in our community, especially from someone who's supposed to protect it." Henry looked down, defeated, knowing that his actions had just cost him more than he'd bargained for. Days later, Officer Henry Winters sat across from his supervisor in a small, sterile office at the station. The footage from the Walmart incident had circulated quickly within the department, leaving Henry with little defense. Sheriff Nancy Westlake's formal complaint had set a series of disciplinary actions in motion. "Officer Winters," his supervisor began, his voice stern, "it's become clear that your actions were reckless, unprofessional, and, frankly, damaging to the department's image. This behavior won't be tolerated. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay, pending further investigation." Henry felt the weight of the words sink in. He knew there was no escaping this, not with video evidence and the testimony of a fellow officer. The shame and regret washed over him as he left the office, facing the consequences he hadn't imagined. Meanwhile, Sheriff Nancy Westlake received a heartfelt letter from Carlos, the Walmart security guard, henrying her for standing up for herself and, indirectly, for others who had experienced similar treatment. The community was inspired by her courage to press charges, sparking important discussions around respect, fairness, and accountability. For Henry Winters, this marked the end of a chapter defined by assumptions and prejudice. For Nancy, it was a quiet victory for justice, a reminder that, sometimes, the most powerful way to fight back is simply by standing firm in truth. And this brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories. Have a nice day.